Now that we have our mic in a preamp and we saw the level, the next step is I want to see my signal on these meters somewhere. And since I plugged into, in this particular case, if I plugged into tie line 5, which goes to preamp 5, I'm pretty sure it's going to come up on channel 5. Obviously, if you plugged into a different preamp number, then it'll come up on a different channel. But in this case, we did 5. I want to be able to speak into my mic and see my signal here on this meter. I'm not seeing it right now, but that's because we know that each of these channels, we got 16 channels here, running from top to bottom, each one of them has 2 inputs. So it has a DAW return, and I don't know if you can see this, but all these red LEDs are lit up across all 16 channels. So that means that all these inputs right now are looking at, all these channels are looking at the input of the DAW return. And for at least channel 5, I'm not interested in the DAW return. I'm interested in the other one, which is, if you look here, it says input, and that is the line input. There are no mic preamps on here. That's why we're using a outboard mic preamp. But the output of that preamp that we plugged into is at line level, and that's what's going to come in here. So I need to somehow switch that. And the way you do that is you choose which channel you want. So I'm going to select channel 5. So there's these select buttons here. By the way, there's some select buttons down here, and those have to do with talking to the DAW. So we're not interested in that right now. We're interested in these select buttons. So I'm going to find channel 5, I'm going to select that. And that activates my channel strip over here. So now any routing or switching thing, pretty much all of that occurs here on the master channel strip. And I'm going to choose, I've already chosen the channel 5, and I'm going to come up here to the input flip and flip it from the DAW return to line in. At that point, I can speak into my mic and I can see a signal there. Now, one thing about the meters on this board is even though this is an analog mixing board with a digital control surface, and it is not a digital mixing board, even though it's an analog mixing board, the meters are digital. And the reason they did that, if we look closely, well, probably not in the video, but you can tell when you come in here next, is that the highest number is 0. So that should be a dead giveaway that this is a digital meter. And the reason they did that is so that way, since you're going to be using a DAW and recording to it, you want to be able to look at one meter instead of having to translate between an analog and a digital meter. We can just look up here. We don't have to look at our computers to see if the level is properly calibrated. So in that case, my operating level on this meter or any digital meter has to be well away from 0, right? Because 0 is our maximum level. So we want it to be about -18, which is down right about here. So actually there's not a -18 here, so I would say -20. In between -20 and -14. So that's where I want my operating level. And what is the operating level? Actually, I'm a little hot, so I'm going to turn it down at the preamp. And a little bit more. There we go. And the operating level is where your signal is going to pass through. It's going to be above that, it's going to be below that, but that's kind of where it's going to average. And that's where we want to keep it. In general, you're going to have to change that depending, of course, on where your microphone is, the instrument you're recording, and things like that. It's probably better to err on the side of being a little bit too quiet than a little bit too loud. So anyways, we have a good signal. I have a signal there. Now, how do I get this out to my DAW? How do I get it to the interface which goes to Pro Tools? The good news is actually we've already done it. The signal is now traveling to the interface, and I didn't have to even bring up any of these faders. The reason is because the output of the channel defaults to being post fader. And there's one row of knobs we haven't talked about, but it's this row here. So on all the 16 channels we have a row here, and it says, well, it looks like it says chop out, but really it's channel output. And it allows us to, one thing, control the level, which is usually at unity, so we just leave it at 12 o'clock normally. But it allows us to pick up the signal in 3 different places. The default is pre-fader, meaning I don't have to bring this fader up to get a signal out. post fader, in which I would have to bring this up. And then there's another one called input. An input is, you can think of it as kind of like a super pre-fader. It actually picks up the signal even before pre-fader would. And so that means it's getting the signal right as it comes in the board and then sending it right back out again. Turns out there's some stuff after that before it gets to the pre-fader point. So we'll just leave it at its default. If we did want to change something though, since it's already selected, of course it's a routing switching thing, so you'd normally come over here, you'd find the channel out, and you could toggle it through the 3 positions. But we're going to leave it at pre-fader.